70 years ago, on July 27, 1953, U.S. and North Korean military commanders signed the armistice, halting the brutal Korean War that killed 4 million lives, separated 10 million Korean families, and leveled the entire Korean peninsula. The armistice was meant to be temporary and replaced with the peace settlement, but this never happened. And 7 decades later, we are facing a security crisis in Korea, and one that could impact all of us. But there is something we can do. We now have a bill, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, H.R. 1369, that calls on President Biden to engage in serious, urgent diplomacy in pursuit of a binding peace agreement to end the Korean War. Nearly 50 co-sponsors signed on in support of this legislation in the last Congress, and we are well on our way to exceeding that number in this Congress. By comparison, in 2010, on the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, only 2 brave representatives, Dennis Kucinich and Barbara Lee, supported our calls for peace. Our progress is the result of grassroots, people-powered movement. We are a broad coalition of multi-generational Korean Americans, veterans, humanitarian aid workers, and individuals whose families have been torn apart by war and division.
My name is Chistine, and I'm the founder and executive director of Women Across DMZ. We are a US-based organization mobilizing women to end the Korean War. I immigrated to the US when I was 3. I come from a large family. I'm the youngest of 10 children, 9 girls and 1 boy, and I live in Honolulu, Hawaii. The reason why I organized this event was because it is the 70th anniversary of the armistice, which the US signed with North Korea in 1953. And in 2015, I organized a women's peace walk on the 70th anniversary of Korea's division by the US and the former Soviet Union. And I felt that this year it was really important to actually have a presence in Washington, D.C., to send a clear message to President Biden and to our Congress that 70 years is enough. It really is time to bring a formal end to the Korean War and negotiate a permanent peace settlement. The situation on the peninsula is growing more and more dangerous, and I think it is time for Americans to understand that we have a responsibility to bring closure to this war. The reason why I think we haven't been able to reach a peace agreement between the US and the DPRK, it's very complicated, but I would say the primary reason is because there is an official state narrative that the Korean War ended in 1953 with just a ceasefire. And so when you hear somebody like President Obama say that the Korean War was a victory, that it was a victory for South Korea, for freedom and democracy. And I think that, first of all, it erases a lot of US responsibility in the division of the Korean Peninsula without consulting a single Korean. It doesn't at all present the long history of actually US backing dictatorship in South Korea, participating in massacres, frankly, whether it was shooting innocent civilians during the Korean War at Nogunri or backing mass genocide, frankly, of the people of Jeju Island who were just simply protesting Korea's division and the creation of 2 separate countries. And to cast them as communists, you know, it just erases, or even the US sending, giving the green light to send paramilitary troops from the DMZ to quash the Gwangju uprising. I mean, you know, this just goes on and on and on, and I think this North Korea is bad and South Korea is good, and that kind of narrative that is perpetuated in the US media, which is frankly part of the military-industrial complex. We are in a David and Goliath fight, you know. But what gives me hope is that we have now new generation, actually multiple generations of progressive Korean American scholars and other scholars of many of these academics who have now been writing books, and now we have films, Deanne Borsche-Leem's films, about her own personal story of adoption and how much that is tied to Korea's division and war and the unresolved war, to Crossings, you know, which documents the role of women in peace building, not just in 2015 and on, but the long history of women's efforts to bring an end to this Korean War. So what gives me hope is we have much more energy. I think that there is frustration, and I think there's just a complete, it's so obvious that the past has not worked. And so it's not just Korean Americans, multi-generational, and not just academics, but humanitarian aid experts who say the sanctions aren't working, they're harming ordinary people. You have people like Dan Leaf, the retired lieutenant general who served 2 tours in South Korea for the U.S. Forces Korea. He was the head commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command at Pearl Harbor. This is quite a diverse coalition of people that have come forward together to say, it's not working. You know, if you actually want to advance U.S. goals of denuclearization or improved human rights or the conditions for the North Korean people, we have to try a new approach. And instead of waiting for peace to be gifted to the Korean people at the end of a process, it must come first. Without peace, there is no foundation to negotiate on the more difficult issues. So that gives me hope. I feel like we're on the cusp of some transformation. I think it's so important to have peace on the Korean Peninsula because as a Korean American, I think that there is so much unresolved trauma and pain for the Korean people. The Korean War is the singular trauma for all Korean people, whether it's the people on the peninsula or throughout the diaspora. And I think we can't fully live with the happiness and the healing without the closure of this war. I mean, we all have stories from our families of so much debate, and it just goes on, you know. Oh, if you are pro-peace, then you must be bargengi or 정복 or, you know. And I think that is really not good for the soul of the Korean people. But I also see peace on the Korean Peninsula as having a huge effect for the entire region. I mean, I think about how the unresolved Korean War has justified the massive militarization of throughout the Pacific and Asia, you know. And I don't ultimately think that the U.S. target is the Korean Peninsula, but the Korean Peninsula plays a very geostrategic role in its efforts against China. And if you look at the long history of U.S. imperialism and forays to Asia, all these places, Hawaii, where I live, was the gas station for the U.S. Navy to, in its, gunboat diplomacy to Japan and then towards China. So I think peace on the Korean Peninsula is critical for world peace, and especially at this moment in the U.S.-China great power competition. We really have to put our attention to the Korean Peninsula because I think that could be truly liberatory for so many people, whether it's in Guam, Okinawa, the Philippines, Japan, and even where I live, Hawaii, which is really, we're in a colonized, occupied place. You know, the Hawaiian people, that was a sovereign nation. And, the U.S. illegally overthrew that country. And so I think it's really important for regional peace and world peace. I believe that the role of especially Americans to help bring an end to the Korean War is by letting our members of Congress know, and somehow through petition letting the president know that the United States must negotiate a peace agreement to end the Korean War. And it's not just a moral responsibility given the long history of U.S. involvement on the Korean Peninsula, but it is what an American commander promised when he signed the armistice 70 years ago. And so that is what we're trying to do as especially a Korean American-led movement, is to build the political will for there to be a peace agreement and to let our members of Congress know. And it's really extraordinary. I mean, yesterday at the press conference, to hear the host of the press conference, who was Barbara Lee, whose father fought in the Korean War. And it was in her conversation with him minutes before she had to cast her vote on whether she would give President George W. Bush authorization to go to war in Afghanistan. She spoke to her father, and he said, there is nothing good that comes from war. And so you must vote no against giving the U.S. authorization to go to war. She was the one person. And to have somebody like her, who was such a senior member of Congress and who may be the next California senator, to say so clearly, this is America's oldest war, and we must bring an end to this war, not just for the Korean people, but for us in the United States, so that we could actually redirect funds that we invest in forever war. More than half of the U.S. budget goes to the military. And how are we ever going to have decent schools and health care and a society that we all feel secure? There is so much inequality in this country. There is so much poverty. 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry. We will never be able to have a good democracy unless we actually end forever wars, like the longest one in Korea. So that's what we're trying to do. Yes, we do it because it is right and morally just for Americans to do that, but we do it also for us, so that we can build a brighter future for us here in the United States. The question whether peace or reunification must come first, I absolutely think peace must come first, and that the efforts of North and South Korea in the past to negotiate an end to the Korean War has been actually stifled greatly by the role of the United States. And so I think that's why Women Across DMZ and the Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network and organizations like KPAC and all those that are working together to bring an end to the U.S. war on the Korean Peninsula is really urgent and important, because we have seen in the past that efforts between North and South Korea to negotiate peace have basically failed, because it always stops at the door of the White House. And so I think that's why we have to bring an end to the Korean War, and that it's a sequential process. And I think, as Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il said, is when they negotiated the June 15th agreement, we will let the Korean people decide the future. But absolutely, I believe that North and South Korea can peacefully coexist. And, I think you just don't know, but you have to meet, you have to know each other, you have to be able to eliminate that demilitarized zone that keeps the Korean people apart, and let's let the future decide. I have been maligned in the media quite a bit, and recently there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by a North Korean defector who is now in the National Assembly. And I think that is a gross mischaracterization of the work that I and Women Across DMZ have done. And I think, if anything, we are great defenders of freedom and human rights and democracy. And I want to really thank so many of the freedom fighters in South Korea who have brought about democracy, who are fighting to defend democracy, and the rest of the world has often looked at South Korea's really robust democracy as a model for the rest of the world. So please, we raise a toast to South Korea's democracy, and especially the Candlelight Revolution that just, shined a light to the rest of the world about what people can do when they build power together, when they take the streets and they defend what is just and humane. So thank you.